We don't argue about what we call evil. We argue about which evils are excusable. And, he says, truth, of course, is stranger than fiction because we've made fiction to suit ourselves. If we can't appeal to a higher power than the government, if the government is the absolute highest power, then yes, it has become God. Whereas the normal person, I think, throughout history has always believed there's something higher than the government. Charity means loving the unlovable, or it's no virtue at all. And hope means hoping when things are hopeless, or it's no virtue at all. And faith means believing the incredible, or it's no virtue at all. Ownership should be expanded. More and more people should be owners in order to really have independence. They should not be relying on big business or on big government.
Dale Ahlquist is an American author and an advocate of the thought and writings of G.K. Chesterton. He is the president and co-founder of the American Chesterton Society and the publisher of its magazine, Gilbert. He's also the co-founder of Chesterton Academy in Minneapolis in the United States. Well, Dale, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this conversation.
John, it's a great honor to be speaking with you from so far away.
Well, as we talk, I must ask you at the beginning, travelling all the way to Australia to talk about G.K. Chesterton. Why? Who was he? And why was he so important in his age? And why do you think he matters now?
I think it's all very strange sounding, isn't it? Especially that an American is traveling to Australia to talk about an Englishman. And the reason is because I think that Chesterton is relevant. Not only that he is relevant, but he's universal. Chesterton was very, very popular writer in his own time, which was the early 20th century. He died in 1936. During that time, really one of the most popular, well-known, well-loved writers in the world. And then he's just faded from the public picture and kind of went into a large eclipse, and then has been rediscovered and reappreciated starting about 25 years ago. And the reason I think that he's been so popular again and re-energized is because he seems to be talking about the time we live in even more than the time in which he lived. He's a very prophetic and timeless writer, but timeless also means timely.
Well, there's a G.K. Chesterton Society in Australia. I'm aware of that, and they publish some quite interesting stuff. I'm on their email feed, so I can say that. You've got a picture of him just behind you. We can actually see it very clearly. He was an interesting-looking fellow. As I understand it, he was a big, bluff man with a great sense of humour.
Yes. He described himself as the politest man in all of England because he could stand up on a bus and offer his seat to 3 women at one time. And,
oh dear.
and he had the great large joviality that he said, I'm sure that the thin monks were holy, but the fat monks were humble. And Chester was very charming, but he was not afraid of making fun of himself and laughing at himself, but he also could laugh at many other things, and he made people laugh. I think one of the interesting things is that this prevents some people from taking him seriously at all. But as Chesterton points out, funny is not the opposite of serious. The opposite of funny is not funny. You could be serious and funny at the same time.
That's an insight in its own right. One of the ones that I heard was that he was at a society do in London during the First World War, and a very proper lady came up to him. She said, Mr. Chesterton, what are you doing here? You should be like our boys, out at the front. To which he replied, well, madam, if you come around to my side, you'll see that I am indeed out at the front. He was very big, I gather.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So tell me, what are you always surprised by when you read and reread Chesterton?
Well, I'm always surprised by how how timely he is. And as I said, he seems to be speaking, across nearly a century now, John, and addressing our civilization in our world right now. When he says things such as, we don't argue about what we call evil, we argue about which evils are excusable. And, he says, truth, of course, is stranger than fiction because we've made fiction to suit ourselves. And we talk about a freedom of religion, but freedom of religion means that we can hardly mention religion. We call it freedom of speech if we can talk about the weather. So these sorts of things tend to ring true across the years.
I must say, I've often thought that is one of the most profound things you could ever imagine, because we live now in an age where people feel rather than think. In fact, we often think that feeling is thinking, and he's going right to the heart of it and saying that that's not surprising because we invent feelings, we invent fictions. It's therefore much easier for us to understand than the great facts of the universe. That's a pretty profound insight, isn't it?
Very profound. And Chesterton, says that it's reason that is under attack. And the problem with the modern world is we've become more sentimental than we have become reasonable.
Yeah. So immediately we can see just how relevant he is to today's age. Some of those incredible quotes, I'd love your response. We looked up a few of them. He said, impartiality is a pompous name for indifference, which is an elegant name for ignorance.
That's a lovely thought. And he's absolutely right. And by the same token, he talks about the agnostic. The agnostic is supposedly more impartial. But the agnostic literally means ignorant. That's what the word literally means. It's simply the Greek form of the Latin form of ignorance. Same root word. And no one ever boasts about being ignorant, but they will boast about being an agnostic, which simply means being ignorant.
Well, that's a valuable insight. Here's another one that seems very important to me. He said, moderate strength is shown in violence, supreme strength is shown in levity. Can you unpack that?
Yeah. So Chesterton says that Satan fell because of the force of gravity. He says it's easy to be heavy, it's hard to be light. Angels fly because they take themselves lightly. The greatest show of strength we can have is restraint. The greatest show of strength is not showing our strength, and by being restrained. And it's as he says, it's easy to be heavy. It's easy to lose our heads, and demonstrate violence. But what's difficult is self-control.
I had a good friend in politics. Sometimes he used to say to me, remember, take the issues and your responsibilities seriously and yourself lightly. Carry yourself lightly. Take the things that you're responsible for seriously. Is that what he's driving at?
Oh, that's it. I mean, that's such a great line. Angels can fly because they can take themselves lightly. What a motif that we must follow in our lives.
That we don't. I don't think I've ever been surrounded by people who take themselves as seriously as I now find. And it's not as if it brings them any great joy.
No, it never does. And pride never does. Pride never does make us happy.
Now, here's one that really puzzles me because on the surface of it, it doesn't make sense at all. Seems counterintuitive. He said that, quote, when learned men begin to use their reason, then I generally discover they haven't got any. That seems counterintuitive. If you're using your reason, surely that's a good thing,
right?
Isn't it?
Well, he's not criticizing the use of reason. He's criticizing the learned man's use of reason. So this is an attack on basically our educational philosophies and our educational institutions, which he is arguing have abandoned reason. And so he's saying when the educated man, the learned man, is using his reason, he doesn't have any. Because his argument, his criticism of our modern educational institutions is that they have cut themselves off from a heritage of strong philosophy, strong thinking, strong use of reason, and they're just following the latest fads and the latest fashions and the newest ideas in the rejection of the old ideas.
Yes, Churchill made the observation that when we stop learning about our past, we become very open to any fad. We pick up any idea because we become rootless. But to come to, I'm sure we'll talk more about that sort of concept. Here's another one. The reformer, lots of reformers around today. The reformer is always right about what is wrong. He is generally wrong about what is right. That one's pretty easy to understand. We see a lot of it.
Yes, it certainly is. I mean, most of us recognize that there are problems with the world. And we agree that there are certain problems. But we don't always agree on what the right solution to those problems is. There's a corollary, I think, John, to that great quotation, which is probably one of the most currently famous ideas about Chesterton that there is. It's called Chesterton's fence. And the concept of Chesterton's fence is this, that he says that there are two kinds of reformers. There's the reformer who comes along and encounters, let's say, a fence. And he says, I do not see the purpose of this fence. Let's tear it down. Whereas the good reformer comes along and says, I will not let you tear down the fence unless you can tell me why the fence was built. And then I may let you tear it down. The whole idea is that we try to change things without understanding why they were there in the first place. And
the importance of history, really.
Yes, exactly. So Chesterton's fence, it's something you will always run against when the very rapid fire reformer wants to change something that he doesn't understand.
Yeah. Here's another one. Once abolish the God, and the government becomes the God. This one I actually do relate to. It's quite a while now since I was in public life. But I became astonished at how often constituents would come to me with a problem, and somehow the answer, as though government was God, was always, no matter what the problem, the answer always began with, so the government's gotta do this, that, or the other. It's an interesting quote, isn't it?
Well, if we can't appeal to a higher power than the government, if the government is the absolute highest power, then yes, it has become God. Whereas the normal person, I think, throughout history has always believed there's something higher than the government. It's something, higher than the powers of this world.
Well, actually, indeed, in a democracy, of course, we say that the people are more important than the government.
Well, that's who the government is supposed to serve. I mean, Chesterton always argues that democracy is the original form of government. And the farther we depart from democracy, the government starts replacing the people, and the people sort of getting in the way of the government. We've lost the original vision of what the government is for when the government becomes more important than the people.
We see evidence of that. The things that government now purports to know more about in terms of the way you should live your life than you know yourself is really quite chilling, because it does actually represent, I think, the governments in our democracies increasingly seeing themselves as moral arbiters, whereas in reality, they should be functions of the people, if I can put it that way, functionaries of the people, rather than us becoming functionaries of government. I think the American forefathers understood these dangers very clearly. But if you don't mind me saying it to an American, I think in common with other Western countries, that is being lost somehow. So during COVID, it was almost as though in this country, certainly in some of the states, the government would say, well, we're giving you back some of your freedoms. And people would say, oh, thank you, government, as though the gifts of freedom were in the government's gift.
Yeah, you make a very astute observation from the other side of the world about America. We definitely had that sort of a vision when the country was founded. But the argument is that we move farther and farther from that vision as we surrender more of our rights to things that we cannot control.
So Dale, back to these quotes. Have we found your favourite in the one that you raised, fact and fiction, and then these ones we worked through? Do you have a favourite amongst those?
Well, amongst those, there's some really good ones. I think the one that the one that I first said before you made your list, I think is truly one of my favorites. That
Yeah.
we've made fiction to suit ourselves, right? That's why truth is stranger than fiction. But I think there's so many good Chesterton quotes, and one that always comes up to me is it's from his book Heretics. He says that charity means loving the unlovable, or it's no virtue at all, and hope means hoping when things are hopeless, or it's no virtue at all, and faith means believing the incredible, or it's no virtue at all. The great Christian virtues: faith, hope, and charity.
Coming to your own thinking as a follower of Chesterton, you've coined the term localism as an important way for society and culture to advance from where we find ourselves today. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? What do you mean by localism?
Sure.
And why is it, as you see it, a way forward?
And what we call localism is a way of enacting what Chesterton's ideas were in regards to politics and economics. But he and his colleague Hilaire Belloc called it distributism, and it was based on a Catholic social teaching, which was developed by Pope Leo XIII at the very end of the 19th century. Their idea was that ownership should be expanded. More and more people should be owners in order to really have independence. They should not be relying on big business or on big government, both of which are very centralized and remote from the common person. Chesterton and Belloc's idea was that we should decentralize as much as possible. And the two main principles are what he called subsidiarity and solidarity. Subsidiarity is the idea that you should control the thing that most directly affects you. And solidarity is that you have this same mentality in common with others too. So that everyone really is a localist. They're taking care of the things that most directly affect them, and they're not being controlled either by a centralized and remote commercial system or a central and remote governmental system. So localism means you support local economies, you run the local government, and you have the most freedom and independence when you do so.
So sort of do for yourself what you can best do for yourself, do those things that are best done for yourself, by yourself, and the same for your neighbour. Don't push it up to the next level unless it's absolutely necessary.
Yes.
Is that a way of looking at it?
Yeah, that's very good. The idea is that by buying from your neighbor rather than buying from a big corporation, you're helping your neighbor out. Your dollars are remaining local rather than flying out of the community. So when people are doing business with each other, it makes for a strong community. When families take care of themselves, it makes for strong families. When families are not broken up by people in the family being employed far away from the home, it makes for a more solid family. It's that principle to be enacted as much as possible that creates more independence. Chesterton says the opposite of employment is not unemployment. The opposite of employment is independence.
Often people say to me that they think we talk endlessly about rights. We ought to talk more about responsibilities. That's much the same vein of thinking, I would put it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Responsibilities means you actually are taking care of your neighbor. And that is the golden rule.
Yeah. Largely abandoned and forgotten now because we think that somehow or other big government should meet the social needs and economic needs of those who are in need, rather than thinking, well, what can I do first? And I think relationally, the idea of us interacting with our neighbours rather than, as somebody once said to me, a salvo with a cup of tea and a bit of cash is going to be of a lot more comfort than a cold check from the Department of Security if you've hit hard times. Can we turn to education? Now, you've been deeply enmeshed in education. I'd love to let you riff a bit on this. and about what you've been doing in your country and what I think you're talking about in Australia. Look, it's a pretty open secret that the state of education in the Anglophone world particularly is very low. I mean, I'm staggered that it's not right up there in lights in my country. Declining standards, including in behaviour in our classrooms, teachers utterly demoralised, parents worried and looking all the time for alternatives, and the sheer numbers, the decline in educational outcomes and in classroom behaviour can't be ignored. It's a very serious problem. We're letting our kids down. We're not equipping them for life or the workplace. You've done a lot of thinking and been very active in this area, and including, I think, pointing us to the fact that universities have become ideological production lines. Firstly, what's gone wrong? And then we might come to what you're trying to do about it.
Well, Chesterton, 100 years ago, I think, identified one of the main things that's wrong with modern education. He says, in the classroom today, the child is exposed to educational philosophies that are younger than he is. In other words, we keep experimenting on our children. We keep trying out new ideas. The latest fad, the latest fashion doesn't work, so we try a new one to replace it. It's always a new idea. It's always the latest idea. And of course, it runs out of relevance almost right away because it's not the right idea. Chesterton argues that it's the oldest things that ought to be taught to the youngest children. The whole definition of education is truth in the state of transmission. It's simply passing the truth from one generation to the next. The teacher is supposed to represent the parent, in loco parentis. The teacher is hired by the parent to represent the parent. But in modern education today, we have clearly driven a wedge between parent and student as the educational institutions think that they are wiser than the parent and simply don't represent the parent. So they don't represent traditional ideas or common sense, but a lot of strange new theories that represent only a minority of thinking and have taken over the educational institutions. So the solution, of course, is to somehow give that power and authority back to the parents, to have schools that represent the parents. And we started a school. It's a high school, what we call it in the United States, but it's the years from age 14 to 18, right before university, and we call it Chesterton Academy, using G.K. Chesterton as a model thinker, in that he thought and wrote about everything and had a very integrated philosophy that really had an answer for all different subjects. So much of education is each subject has been divided from the other subject so that there's no relevance, there's no connection to anything. It's all separating everything from everything else. Chesterton says the world has become one wild divorce court. So we put together a curriculum where what we teach in one subject is directly connected to what's being taught in another subject, and so that the student becomes a coherent and comprehensive thinker, and it's all informed by a strong and comprehensive philosophy. Most high schools don't teach philosophy at all. Most high schools have made art an option. We require art because we teach truth, goodness, and beauty. So students develop an artistic sense along with their ability to reason and to calculate and to use logic. They also develop their creative imaginations, and they have a good sense of history and literature and truth.
As one who would very much like to believe and thinks it's worth trying everything we can to reform mainstream education systems, particularly in my country, I have to be absolutely firm in saying that parents are plainly seeking alternatives, which ought to be a real wake-up call for those who are responsible for the mainstream education system. I think something approaching 40% of children now are not in the government-run schools in Australia. And I don't advocate that as a good thing. I think far better to try and respond to what parents are plainly saying. And that leads into a question for you, because I'm very aware that in America now you've got vast numbers of parents opting for homeschooling. For the new classical schools, they seem to be exploding. What have you seen with your own Chesterton Academy? Is there a demand for spots there? How are your academic outcomes going? Are parents happy? Is it working for children? Pat it out. Tell us more about how it's going and what you're learning and how well it's coming together.
Yes, good. We started the first Chesterton Academy in the U.S. in 2008, 16 years ago. And almost right away, our school started growing pretty quickly right away. But then other people from around the country said, well, how did you do that? We want to do the same thing. And so we put together a package to show how we started our school, and we helped other people start their schools. So the second school started in 2014, 10 years ago. In the last 10 years, John, over 60 schools have started. So it's on average 10 new schools a year. And we've shown parents how they can start their own school and how they can fund it and organize it and put together the teachers. We give them the curriculum. We have given parents the ability to start their own schools. And they are swarming to the idea. We think we'll have 100 schools in the next 3 years total, because we've really put a wonderful tool into parents' hands, and there's nothing more important to them than their children, and they have the drive to do it, and they know that this is not being done anywhere else. It's a classical program, and ours is a very Catholic program, but it's classical. We teach the great books, we teach philosophy, and we teach the arts along with a strong math and science curriculum.
How well would you say, let's be frank about this, your educational results as the kids leave school are going, and what is it opening up options for them?
Yes,
I suppose the blunt question is
yes,
it equipping them for life as well as for the workplace? Because I guess many parents in my country would say, well, the chief objective of education is to make sure you can get a good job at the end of it. But then there's a dismay that it seems that the classrooms are full of ideology. The curriculum's designed to shape them in the values that are, we had this discussion a moment ago, that are faddish at the moment, rather than teach them the basics so that they can think for themselves. So I guess there's two questions there, but the key one in it all, or several questions, but the key one is, are you getting the results that would encourage parents to think if my boy or my girl, boys, girls, go through one of these institutions, they will be equipped for the workplace and for life?
Yes, we've seen just great success in our few years that we've been operating. Our students are being courted by colleges and universities around the country because they are such great critical thinkers. They have a better high school education than most university educations already, because we teach them how to think and we give them a lot of material, and they just become very good students. So in many cases, they will go on and continue their education and get advanced degrees. But in many cases, and I think this is probably the most pointed answer to your question, in many cases, at the end of their high school experience, they have had an education that is just as good as what they would get in many universities, and they're ready for a trade. They're ready to work in a more complicated environment because their minds have been so well prepared, and they could avoid the debt of continuing with university education, and they're ready to go to work right away and make a living and pursue a trade because they're become well-formed thinkers. Obviously, the ones who are going to become doctors and lawyers are well prepared to continue their education. So we've just seen really positive results in a short time, and it's also exposing the fact that a lot of universities are not offering anything anymore to advance a young person's career or to make them better thinkers. And if they're well prepared at a younger age, they don't need a college or a university degree to get a good job. They can get it right away just by proving that they're good thinkers.
Changing the focus for a moment in terms of contemplating Australia, you're lecturing in my homeland and so forth. You will have done a bit of thinking, I suppose, about the way in which the world is changing. As an Australian, I look at America and I think they are the leaders of the free world. They seem divided, and we worry about declinism in the West generally. Any thoughts as global economic and probably geopolitical power gradually shifts towards the Asia Pacific about the significance of the relationship between between America and Australia?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to my visit very much to Australia. I've been there one other time, and obviously we share many common values and a very common history, which was so fascinating. But I think that there's a future connection. It's always going to be strong. It was George Bernard Shaw who made the famous quip that the Americans and the English are separated by the same language. It's in some cases that's true of Australia, but the commonality of the language does make for a natural bond in communication. There's no question that we have a bond because we do speak the same language, but we do share a very similar cultural history where we're both nations of outcasts, and most people from our countries have come from other places, right? And so they're both sort of new worlds in the scheme of things, and yet they're well established. So that even though we're new countries, we're countries that have lasted a long time when there's been major regime changes in more historical countries than ours, and so there's a solidarity that I think is very informative and to our mutual benefit. But I think of we obviously get a lot of our entertainers from Australia. I don't know why that is. They come over here with their Australian accents and they just cover them up and become American movie stars. I haven't figured out how they do that, but I think there's an intellectual exchange as well as an entertainment exchange, and I hope that can be positive. However, at the same time, I'll go back to what we talked about, localism, John. I think all of our solutions have to start at the local level. And to the extent that we can share these ideas and implement them locally, that's when the solidarity comes in. We're operating together, yet each in our locale.
Well, you'll be interested to know, in many ways, British drama is still very, very popular in Australia. And two of our free-to-air television networks are currently screening Father Brown. And of course, they're based on the character developed by G.K. Chesterton. Some of my listeners mightn't have made that connection because he wrote quite a series, didn't he? And what was he seeking to do in those books, by the way? Because plainly they go to his personal convictions, but they also go to his capacity, I think, to reveal great moral truths by reflecting the way in which ordinary people live their lives.
Yes, the popularity of Father Brown is an interesting phenomenon because it's been popular ever since he created the character over 100 years ago. The Father Brown stories have always been in print; they've never gone out of print since they were first published. And
is that right?
Yeah, and what has been the appeal of this character? Well, he's sort of the antithesis of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is the super sleuth, the brain that is like a superhero brain, who can figure out that, the guy walking in the next room has a parent that's from Lithuania. The powers of ratiocination that the normal person does not have. Father Brown has no great advantage over anybody else. He's just a little more observant. And he's considered an underdog because people dismiss him because he's a Catholic priest. And everybody knows Catholic priests don't know anything. And that gives him a strange advantage that he is the underdog detective. And detective fiction, as a result, has changed from the Sherlock Holmes to the underdog detective. But of course, Chesterton uses each story as a little morality tale, and there's always a great lesson in it. But he loves the mystery genre because the whole thing about life itself is we're trying to solve a problem. We're trying to solve the mystery of life itself, and in his many mysteries, well, we certainly we find the puzzle, we find the solution to the puzzle, but there's always a bigger story that's being told.
Well, that prompts me to ask then, I was amazed, you just said something that amazed me. Those books have never been out of print. Tells you that he's still seen as enjoyable and I think relevant by many people. What would you recommend? Give us 4 or 5 books that you would say to the listeners, our listeners now, that they ought to read in the context of the things that we've been talking about, the relevance of great thinkers, a great thinker like G.K. Chesterton, who's been gone for, 8.5, 9 decades now.
Yes. Well, let's start with the Father Brown stories. They're timeless and they can always be enjoyed. They're better than the BBC series, but I'll give the BBC series a credit that they capture the fact that this priest that you don't expect to be so smart is the one who always is the one who figures out the solution, and they make him a very positive character. But they're totally enjoyable on the fiction side. He's a master essayist. Chesterton made his living as a journalist, and he wrote thousands of essays. Any collection of Chesterton essays, such as Tremendous Trifles or All Things Considered, his essays are wonderful. He's a master of that form. And, 1,500 words is all you have to commit yourself to at one time. So I would recommend a book of essays. And then I would recommend his book Orthodoxy, which is a powerful exercise in rhetoric where he defends his Christian faith. And it's an immensely quotable book. I quoted the line earlier, angels fly because they take themselves lightly. That comes from Orthodoxy. And then there's another book called What's Wrong with the World? What's Wrong with the World? Another very prophetic and timely book. And that's where he talks about some of the things we've discussed today, that the 4 things wrong with the world, 3 of them are big government, big business, and public education. So he's very timely on that. 1910 is when that book was written. And then, so I gave you 4? You said 5? You asked for 5, John?
There you go.
Yeah. I think another, there's just so many I could choose from, but his book on St. Francis of Assisi. Here's a saint that's still considered a universal saint. Chesterton gives you an inside look at one of the great saints of all time, and it's unlike any other book you've read. It's unlike any book by Chesterton as well.
One of Australia's most respected journalists and a good personal friend of mine is Greg Sheridan. And Greg Sheridan is a great fan of G.K. Chesterton's. And I think one of the main reasons he would give for saying he admires Chesterton and thinks he's relevant today is that he thinks he absolutely models how to disagree well. He was someone who counted amongst his friends those who, many who in fact had vastly different worldviews, but he always maintained the friendships, was warm, was friendly, was witty. that, I think, is something we really need to contemplate in an age where if you dare to disagree with me, it seems, the motto is that I will cut you down, I will destroy you. It's become a business almost of how dare you threaten my identity by disagreeing with me. He does demonstrate, doesn't he, a bigness, and he was a big man physically, but a bigness of spirit and of generosity of spirit.
Yeah, he was known as the man with no enemies because he was so amiable, and he was lovable too. People just were drawn to his goodness and his warmth, but he knew how to argue charitably, and he never put his opponent down as a person, but he would argue with the opponent's argument. He'd go after the idea and not the person. In fact, he always tried to find something common, some idea that he held in common with his opponent, and consequently, people couldn't get angry at him. He couldn't get mad at him, and he would make them think that they were always drawn to him because of his goodness and his humility, and of course his humor. And that's such a great lesson for us today. I mean, there is this renewed popularity in Chesterton, but truly, if he were alive today, he'd be one of the most famous personalities because he can turn out the great quotation, and he knew how to argue so that you'd want to see him engage with an opponent. It would be a delight. And in fact, when he lived, people would pay to see him debate with people like George Bernard Shaw or Bertrand Russell or Clarence Darrow, famous skeptics and doubters and naysayers. And Chesterton, representing kind of tradition and orthodoxy, knew how to handle them so that the opponents couldn't get angry at him. They loved him. What a great lesson. And we need to hear the other side of the argument. We have to hear it done well.
I agree. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, two of his great friends were George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells. Now, they were both outstanding and very outspoken critics of Christianity. And yet he's this brilliant man who takes Christianity seriously while his peers are pouring scorn on it. And yet he does so in a way when frankly, I mean, I don't think there's any other way of putting this. His wisdom and insights serve us well today, whereas the others, frankly, not belittling what they contributed, but it's not of the same level as what Chesterton's given us.
No, I don't think.
In other words, he survived the test of time.
Yes, he has survived, and we read Chesterton for his ideas. We read H.G. Wells for his science fiction. We read Bernard Shaw for his his witty plays, but we don't read their philosophies because they have nothing to tell us at all. There's nothing fulfilling or satisfying about them at all.
Well, Dale, you've been very generous with your time, and I wish you well, and I hope that this has been an interesting conversation for many, and you've got a recommended reading list, those of you who have been intrigued.
John, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for your very insightful questions. And I look forward to coming and meeting with my friends in Australia. It'll be just a delight.